The following program has been provided by the Pacifica Radio Archives Preservation and Access Project. For more information, call 1-800-735-0230 or log on to pacificaradioarchives.org.
The subject of today's discussion is the invasion of Czechoslovakia. As my commentary, I shall read to you an article by Avis Brigg from the forthcoming issue of my magazine, The Objectivist. Needless to say, I agree with the views expressed in this article, and I want them to be heard. I quote from Cultural Trends by Avis Brigg. Quote, according to the Brothers Grimm, there was once a shepherd boy who so loved excitement that he was forever turning in false wolf alarms for the fun of seeing the villagers come running to the pasture, armed with clubs and guns to deal with a wolf. As time went on, and no wolf was ever there when the villagers arrived, fewer and fewer of them answered his calls for help. And finally, when the wolf actually came, no one at all paid any attention to him, and the wolf ate him up. If the Grimms were collecting folk tales today, they might find a story that goes like this. Once there was a shepherd boy who was so afraid of having enemies that he refused to believe that wolves existed at all. When the wolf made off with one of his flock, he always managed to think of some likely-sounding story with which to convince himself and the villagers that no wolf had been involved. The wolf grew strong and commenced to raise a family, and the shepherd boy got better and better at inventing stories to account for the diminution of his flock, so that pretty soon no one believed in wolves any longer, and the wolf and his cubs could walk through the village streets without fear of being recognized. If the story were carried to its logical conclusion, the ending would be far worse than that of the original tale. For if the wolves were smart enough to realize that the shepherd boy was the best friend they had, they could pull down all the sheep and indeed all the villagers as hunger decreed. All they would have to do would be to save the shepherd boy until last, for he would always find a way of convincing the survivors that there were no wolves. Indeed, I suspect that he would be telling himself the same thing even while the wolves were dragging him off to their lair. There are wolves aplenty in the world today, and our government and our press and our halls of learning are literally full of shepherd boys who cannot allow themselves, or anyone else if they can possibly help it, to believe in wolves. Unlike the shepherd boy in the story, they are willing to admit that Soviet Russia once was somewhat carnivorous. But, they insist, she has filed down her fangs and become a vegetarian. She might unthinkingly get a little rough at times, but she means well and would never hurt a soul. 12 years ago, that particular wolf pulled down the equivalent of one of the villagers. Russia invaded Hungary and brutally crushed its people and has been gnawing their bones ever since. The free world stood in horrified paralysis and watched unbelieving, and no one lifted a finger to help. Since then, Russia has been involved in many coups and attempted coups among the developing nations. American troops have been killed by Soviet guns and bombs everywhere they have fought in the last 20 years. And once Russia went so far as to indicate quite clearly that the United States was on her list. Russian missiles aimed at the industrial and population centers of the United States were installed in Cuba. But our shepherd boys keep telling us how friendly are Moscow's intentions, how good-hearted are the people of Russia, how much the Soviet government has mellowed over the years. Now, once more, one of the civilized nations, Czechoslovakia, has attempted to free itself of its bondage to Moscow and has been crushed under the tanks of the Red Army. The Czechs, knowing that there was no hope of assistance if they rebelled forcibly against Russian rule, knowing that if they were to stand at all, they would have to stand alone, use no weapons but their courage. We may never know just how bloody the crushing of the Czech rebellion was. All we know is that it is not over yet, and that Moscow, with its enforced trade and tribute agreements, will be chewing the bones of that gallant nation for a good many years to come. It happened again, and again we stood helplessly by, watching in disbelief. And before the corpse of that battle for freedom was cold, some of our shepherds were busily explaining that it didn't mean a thing, that Russia was not going back to her old habits, that the ruthless suppression of Czechoslovakia had nothing to do with Russia's international policies. And how do they propose to convince us of such a thing? Ironically, they have chosen a concept which was once used by socialists all over the world to condemn capitalism, the concept of spheres of influence. They have taken it out of the mothballs, brushed it off, and turned it inside out to make it respectable. This policy, they say, and do not mention that they once called it a vicious policy of which only capitalist nations were guilty, is necessary for world peace. James Reston, in the New York Times of September 13, 1968, quotes Walter Lippmann as saying, quote, "Recognition of spheres of influence is a true alternative to globalism. It is the alternative to communist globalism, which proclaims a universal revolution. It is the alternative to anti-communist globalism, which promises to fight anti-communist wars everywhere. The acceptance of spheres of influence has been the dominant foundation and the détente in Europe between the Soviet Union and the West. Eventually, it will provide the formula of coexistence between Red China and the United States." Close quote. Mr. Reston agrees. It is not a fair policy, he admits, but, quote, "it is a practical formula for minimizing the tensions between the nations that have the power to start a world war." Close quote. He also admits that the Soviet action in Czechoslovakia was somewhat different from America's demands that Russia remove its missile bases from Cuba, but he adds that the problem appears to be one of definitions. Russia and the United States must define their own spheres of influence, and we must both agree on what is and is not meant by the term sphere of influence. Tom Wicker, in the New York Times of September 22, 1968, offers another suggestion on how to ignore the fact that Russia